I got to see the contest up close and personal when we were essentially debating whether or not we were going to try to assassinate, and I use that term carefully, Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan with a Predator drone that was overflying him and surveilling him, or at least we had good evidence to believe it was him. We were 70-80% certain. We couldn't do it because at that point we had not armed the Predator. Once 9/11 occurred, we went hell-bent to arm Predator and even develop other drones that could be lethal. It's a technology that can be used. Technologies that can be used will be used more often than not. But it's here with us right now, and we need the rules, we need the regulations, we need the precedents, we need the protocols, we need the international and domestic law, and we need the practice that goes along with what we anticipate being the future.
We hadn't used them in the armed and the lethal capacity until after the September 11th, 2001 attacks. And the reason for that were Israel showed proof of concept, so showed that it really was possible to be militarily useful. So the U.S. has used them in the so-called war on terror, both within Afghanistan, to reach remote areas that the U.S. otherwise would not be able to project military force. That's where it began. And the U.S. took existing technologies. So they took Predator and Reaper drone planes that were used for intelligence and surveillance and armed them with off-the-shelf missile technology that they had. So they basically paired Hellfire missiles to Reaper and Predator drones. And that's the lethal drone technology that the U.S. has today. Other countries have different variants of that technology, but they are basically taking off-the-shelf technology for remotely piloted intelligence and surveillance vehicles and putting different missile technology on them. So the U.S. has used them primarily in the war zones in Afghanistan, and then also has used them outside of war zones. And this is perhaps the area that's most troubling when we look at both the moral and the legal concerns, has used them outside of war zones in Somalia, in Libya, in Yemen, in Pakistan, and other places. So civilian deaths are very controversial. The proponents of drones say that these technologies, using lethal technologies on these remotely piloted vehicles, that it is more humane and more able to discriminate and to decrease civilian deaths. But that's very controversial because there's not a lot of transparency and accountability about the number of these strikes, and there's also great controversy about how you count civilian deaths. So the number that we have in terms of the number of deaths overall, probably the best number was given unintentionally in 2013 by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina. And he revealed that there'd been over 4,700 deaths from drone strikes. The Obama administration gave a much lower number in July of this past year, July 2016, and they said there'd been 2,500 deaths of drone strikes outside of battlefields, so outside of Afghanistan and Iraq would be most likely. The Obama administration claims that very, very few of those outside battlefield deaths from drones were to civilians. So they claim a number of between 64 and 116. But almost all external sources say that number is a fantasy. And the reason for that is how you determine your targets and how you count whether someone was a combatant or not. There have been many reports from people who were part of the program, from whistleblowers, those who participated in the program, that one of the main ways in which folks are targeted are through targeting their suspicious activities, and not through targeting a named personality strike, a named person, but through what's called signature strikes. So doing reconnaissance and saying, look, does this activity that we're seeing add up to what we think is suspicious behavior? Therefore, we think this is a military combatant who we could legally and morally strike. More than half, so the majority of these strikes have been against signature strikes, those folks that we don't name, we don't have a particular person in mind, but by the behavior, it seemed to be suspicious. The Obama administration is counting almost all of that as actual combatants.
How do we get drone news now, the attack of these drones? Radio, TV, internet, you name it. It's headline news in this part of the world. And even though sometimes I think when the news, you run news in some parts of North America or Europe, it says, you know, a serious threat to citizens in Europe or America was taken out. But they don't mention the innocent children, the trauma, the houses destroyed, and what effect that has left. They really have been not serious analysis. I don't have scientific data, but we are seeing since 9/11, you know, Afghanistan, Iraq, drones, troops, billions of dollars spent, training of new governments, training of new armies and soldiers on these new nation-building adventures and experiments. And is my region, my community, my country safer? Absolutely not. I think the insecurity, the level of insecurity, not just in our part of the world, but I think around the globe, has increased.
Precedents being set by our use of UAVs are very frightening to contemplate. We have 86 countries in the world right now who have UAV technology. We have 19 countries that have lethal UAV technology and the capability to use it. We have 9 countries who have used it, and they include the United States, the United Kingdom, Nigeria, Iraq, Iran, and another couple of countries. There is not a single technology of warfare in the history of warfare which hasn't been adopted and used by others and ultimately used against the hegemon itself, whether that hegemon be Rome, Assyria, Britain, or whatever empire has used it in the past. It will happen. We will have it used against us. That's why it's so dangerous to be setting these precedents of, for example, flying across borders with countries with whom you're not at war and killing people. What's to stop China from doing the same thing? What's to stop Russia from doing the same thing? And the proliferation of these UAVs around the world is also frightening. Let's look at how Russia got its most competent UAVs, including lethal ones. They bought them from Israel. This is easily doable. If you got the money, you can buy them.
The number of countries that have lethal drone technologies is increasing every day. The low number is 50. Others are saying we're up to about 75 or 80 today. Many countries have drone technology for lots of purposes, for border control, for environmental purposes, for intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, for humanitarian purposes. But then arming those drones, kind of going along the path that the United States did, taking the technology that they had developed for other purposes and giving them the lethal armed technology, more and more countries are passing that threshold. So probably by the time this video is produced, the number will be even greater. And there's really no limits to that number. There's 193 countries in the world today, and many, many more than the 75 to 80 that currently have them could get armed drones, because these are widely available commercial technology. There's not restrictions in the sale of these technologies. So they're very easy to buy, to purchase in the marketplace, or to develop to add on munitions to your existing drone technology. So there's really no upper limit on that. And of course, the big concern is, what are the numbers of non-state actors that have lethal drones? We know that all the 4 types of non-state actors, so terrorist groups, and international criminal cartels, the illegal non-state actors, and non-governmental actors and multinational corporations, the legal non-state actors. We know that all four of these types of non-state actors have drones and are using drones in their business operations. So humanitarian groups use them for surveillance. The United Nations uses them to try to record war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, to track refugee flows. So there's lots of humanitarian uses for these remotely piloted vehicles. The commercial zone, Google, Amazon, they all want same-day delivery, so they are all in on developing drone technology for commercial purposes. Drug lords are already using drones to deliver their drug contraband, so international criminal cartels are already using them. We do need to develop new international law as well as new domestic law governing the use of drones. We need that for non-lethal drones, because we're expanding the use of these new technologies across commercial sectors, humanitarian sectors, across all of these venues, law enforcement. So we need and are trying to scramble to keep up with the technology to develop new laws for how these drones will be used for legal, commercial, and humanitarian law enforcement purposes. The same is true of drones' use in lethal warfare contexts. Some would argue for a total ban on drones. Others would argue for a limitation on the use of drones. Either of those are really important ways to go. You could argue for a total ban because the ways they have been currently used have been violating both law and moral constraints. Or you could argue that at least there should be a radically curtailed and limited use of drones and put some new laws in place that would govern that. Either one of those paths would be better than what we have now, which is really the Wild West. Here's why the U.S., as the leader in the use of lethal drones, needs to become a leader in law, in international law and domestic law governing the use of drones. Right now, the proponents of drones have been looking at it as this is only in the U.S. interest to expand the use of these new technologies, thinking that only the United States could use these technologies for our political, military, or even economic gain. Other actors can use these technologies against us. And if we want to limit the violence that could be done against us by these new technologies, we need to very seriously think about what these laws curtailing the use of lethal drones should be, and we need to be at the forefront of advancing new legal safeguards regarding the use of drones.
Because lethal drones are operated by the CIA, they are not transparent and they are not discussed and debated in Congress. So one measure that the Friends Committee on National Legislation has promoted is to have to promote transparency, to get Congress to report on this, and having the Department of Defense actually oversee this program as opposed to the Central Intelligence Agency would be one step that could be taken for greater transparency. Having that level of greater transparency, we believe, would at least bring this program out into the open and allow for a greater scrutiny by the public, a greater understanding by the public about this tool that that at this point that the country's using through our intelligence operations, as opposed to a military solution. And we've seen that as there's increasing data and information about how conflicts can be resolved nonviolently, and so I think thinking about how do we incorporate that knowledge into and that practice into what our public policies are is something that we believe is an essential way for us to address violent conflict and to avert the use of lethal drones as what some people may see as a solution. In fact, it is not a solution. It is exacerbating extremist behavior, we believe.
I think that Americans underestimate the impact that drone strikes have abroad, not in terms of people who are killed or property damage, but the political and psychological impact that drone strikes have had on communities where drones have been used. And the failure to disclose information to the American public when people in Yemen, people in Pakistan are living the experience of drones creates a very discordant situation. Ask a Yemeni civilian if there was a drone strike in his or her village and they can point to the rubble. Ask an American and they have no idea and their own government won't disclose it. So I think that alone is problematic. I also think that the American public can't properly engage as a policy matter with the use of drones if the American public doesn't have information about where, when, and why they're being used. Just as a matter of good democracy to begin with, the American public needs to have information about what its government is doing in order to engage with it. I think one of the really tragic things in the many years post 9/11 now that we've experienced has been a narrative coming from the government that citizens sort of have to accept at face value and can't engage with. That narrative is often not accurate. So if the narrative is drone strikes are necessary, criminals are being killed, war criminals are being killed, people who might have committed crimes against American citizens are being killed, that's information the public is fed by the government. But the public has no way to challenge that, has no way to know if it's accurate, has no way to determine whether, even if accurate, it's a good use of public resources or what the secondary impacts are of drone strikes abroad. So from a sort of good governance democracy perspective, I think that information is essential. And as a legal matter, I think it's essential. I think that American citizens need to know what their government is doing. I think the global citizenry needs to know how targeted killings are taking place, how these weapons are being used, so that there can be a better public conversation about them.
I think that the drone program, just like any other national security program, should reflect democratic consent. There should be a base of democratic consent for a policy like that, especially a policy that is so consequential. And the secrecy that surrounds the drone campaign means that there's a disconnect between what Americans know and what the government's actually doing. And, I think that there are programs, national security programs, that the government is able to carry out only because of secrecy. That was true of the interrogation programs under the Bush administration. And even with the drone campaign under the Obama administration, at the beginning of the Obama administration, almost nothing was public about drone strikes overseas. And then over time, largely as a result of litigation, the Obama administration released a little more information. More information got out from journalists who were able to visit Yemen and Somalia. And when more information got out, the government was forced to change its policies. And it narrowed the policies, at least at the margins. In May of 2013, the Obama administration imposed presidential policy guidance that was intended to narrow the drone campaign in some respects, regularize it, make sure that civilian casualties were, or at least make an effort to minimize civilian casualties. And, I don't think those changes were sufficient, but those changes were made possible by transparency.
One of the characteristics of this type of warfare is that the drone operators are not at risk.
Yes.
They're not in a kill or be killed situation. They're an eye in the sky operating in physical safety thousands of miles from the battlefield. So this creates a situation that we could call a moral hazard.
Yes, very much so.
If I don't have any skin in the game, it can lower the threshold for the use of lethal force. There's no risk of American blood being shed in most cases, unless there's boots on the ground, U.S. troops on the ground.
This is not traditional war. This is, you're 10,000 miles away, you're totally immune from any counterattack or any measures to be used against you, and you're watching people, often for a period of time, who are at a funeral, who are at a party, who are walking down a street, who are coming out of a house or whatever, and suddenly all the criteria come together, as it were, and you're told to pull the trigger. And you not only watch the hellfire strike and you watch the explosion, but oftentimes you monitor the aftermath. The person crawling away with his leg missing, the woman bleeding to death on the alley as you watch, and so forth. This is a different kind of warfare, and frankly, I wouldn't have anything to do with this kind of warfare.
The Catholic Church has really wrestled with the question of the use of force or the questions of war and peace from the very beginning, right? The Church in its earliest time, relied heavily on the nonviolence tradition flowing directly from the gospel, from Jesus' own example of turn the other cheek. Not a passive resistance to evil, but actually an active resistance to evil, but one that nevertheless was nonviolent. But as the church, as Christianity grew and members of the church took on the responsibility to protect innocent civilians, to protect from invasions that were coming in from the outside, the church then developed a teaching on the just use of force, the use of force to protect, the use of force under very strict moral conditions. And this was an attempt to reconcile the commitment to love with a commitment to protect innocent human life out of that same motivation of love. And so under St. Augustine and then later St. Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic Church developed a whole tradition of teaching on the just use of force, or what is commonly called just war, but I prefer to call just use of force, because often just war is misinterpreted. War is never a good thing. It's never sometimes it's a tolerated evil within our moral system. And of course, even within the just war tradition, there's a commitment to always use nonviolence first, that you have to exhaust every other nonviolent means of resolving a conflict first, and that the use of force is always a last resort.
But if a city is located near a border, no matter what their intent is, then the citizens of that city are allowed to go out with weapons to defend themselves. And the idea is that a border city is particularly vulnerable, and vulnerable done to the rest of the nation, and from that they could stage other raids against other cities. If in any location the invaders' intent was to take Jewish lives, or if they engaged in battle with a city or laid siege to it, without stating any specific intention, then Maimonides teaches we must wage war against them. So, and the Sabbath laws go by the wayside. You don't have to worry about Sabbath laws. Everyone's in on that to defend themselves. So the question is there a right to self-defense in Jewish law and Jewish tradition? So the Torah doesn't speak about explicitly a right to defense for a community, just for individuals. So in the beginning of chapter 22 of Exodus, it speaks about if someone invades one's house through a tunnel, the owner of that house can defend himself against that person. And if it says it's at night, when it's not clear what the intent is, then you can even take that person's life in order to defend yourself. So there is a commandment to defend oneself for individuals, but there's no broader commandment for a community to defend themselves. And so because of that, and the Torah just took on this, and the later rabbis took on this idea that, well, broadly speaking, there is a right to self-defense, but one must ascertain the intent of what if their intent is to take people's lives, then you have every right to defend yourself and even to take their life in order to do that.
When we talk about these things and when we have our different kinds of alliances of theologians, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, we exactly feel that we are in the same position. There is a consensus that all of us have same concerns. Well, the Quran tells us that we should go to war only if we are oppressed or persecuted for our faith. We are not allowed to practice our religion. So that's a very critical thing. Or if we are existentially in danger, then you have to defend yourself. So it's more of a defense of person or land, or defense of our religion. These are the things. But Quran also very clearly talks about the people with whom you are fighting. You have to make sure that there is no unintended casualties.
One of the things that's happened in the United States especially is that the line about warfare used to be quite clear. When the Congress declared war, we were at war. When it didn't declare, we weren't. But now, Congress has not declared war for years, and yet we've been engaged in warfare all over the place. Drones are used in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Mali, Gaza, Iraq, Syria, the list goes on. Almost 100% of the victims and targets are Muslims.
United Methodist Church believes that war is incompatible with the teachings of Jesus Christ. What does it mean to be a global church? And if we're a global church, we just don't look at how the United Methodists who live in the U.S. see it, but you also look at it as how people through a global lens see it. So we've seen the devastating impact of wars, not just on the U.S. troops and families, but also the devastation that wars cause in a country. Now we're told we need to go to war to stop what's happening to the Syrian people, with an understanding we did that in Iraq. We said we wanted to do that in Libya, and now we look what we have. We said we wanted to bring about peace, development in Afghanistan, and all we now have is endless war. I think it's more important for us now to look at diplomacy as a way, and including people in the process to end wars.
A song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But other lands have sunlight too and clover, and skies are everywhere.